It's a beautiful fall day in Minneapolis. It's a good day to go thrifting. On today's trip to the thrift store, I found this mid-century Lane cedar chest. It was priced higher than I'd like to pay for something like this in this condition, but I needed a project, and I haven't been finding much else lately, so I picked it up for $77. The condition was a little rough. It had the usual scratches and dings and things. The worst was probably the top. There were areas of finish missing and had scratches all over. The interior was in great shape and still had the postcard that you would mail in to get your $1,000 guarantee against moth damage. It was also missing one knob, and I decided to just make all new knobs for it, which you'll see later. I began by stripping off the old finish, and I used a combination of sanding and paint stripper. I usually prefer using paint stripper as opposed to sanding the finish off because there's less risk of damaging the veneer. But in this case, I decided to sand the finish off the top since it was already gone in some spots, and then I used a stripper on the rest of it. Once I got off most of the finish with the sander, I went back with a utility knife blade and just scraped off whatever finish was remaining at the edges, the areas that I was avoiding with the sander. On the sides and the front, I used a paint stripper that is supposed to work in 15 minutes, and I just applied a nice heavy coat. And I gave it about 15-20 minutes, and then I scraped it off. And it did pretty well, although it did leave some finish still on, so I did end up applying a second coat. It was only about 45 degrees out when I was doing this, so if it was warmer, it may have worked better. Then I went over it with some fine steel wool and mineral spirits just to get off any residue. While the piece was drying, I made some new knobs. I started by cutting an oak dowel into 4 equal parts. I then drilled a hole in the center of each of those parts. And this was a pilot hole for a screw. Once the screw was in, I took a Dremel tool and cut off the head of the screw. And once the head of the screw was off, then I could just chuck it into my drill. And then I just took some sandpaper and a file and shaped the knob so that I just got a little bit of a taper and rounded the edges off. The file was good for removing a lot of material at once. And the sandpaper worked well for the final smoothing and shaping. And once I had them where I wanted them to be, I just applied some gel stain to get the color closer to the color of the cedar chest. Once the chest had dried, then I could just do some light sanding in preparation for the stain. And the sides and the front really didn't need much sanding. I just went over them by hand with some 180 grit just to smooth out any grain that had been raised from the stripping process. And I also noticed after I had sanded the front, there were still some spots where the finish wasn't removed, so I just scraped that off. On the top, I had to do quite a bit more sanding because I had gone over it with 80 grit sandpaper to remove the finish, which is a very coarse grit. So I had to go up through the grits to remove any scratches left by the 80 grit paper. So I started with 120 and then went to 180. When the sanding was all done, I could then apply the stain. I used just a regular oil stain by Varathane. It's called American Walnut. And I just wiped it on and then wiped it right off. I don't let stains sit on the wood for very long. It never really seemed necessary to me. I usually just wipe it on and then wipe it right off. On the legs, I decided not to bother stripping off the finish, and instead I just gave it a light sanding and then applied a gel stain to freshen it up a little bit and bring it closer to the color of the rest of the piece. And on the feet, I just brushed on some new black paint. Once the stain was dry, I applied the top coat, which was a satin oil-based wipe-on polyurethane. And here it is, all done, complete with its new knobs installed. Thanks for watching.